Well, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Kimberly Sukalis with the Lister Hill Center for Health Policy. I'm really excited about today's webinar with Dr. Adam Brooks on how we can have effective conversations with people who fundamentally disagree with us. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Adam Brooks is a nationally renowned public speaker with a PhD in Communication and Information Sciences, an MA in Communication Studies, and a background in public relations. His research focuses on rhetoric in the areas of diversity, identity, and cultural studies. As the director of the speaking studio at the University of Alabama, he helps clients clarify and craft effective messages, cultivate dynamic deliveries, and calm public speaking anxiety. Dr. Brooks is also an expert in the areas of diversity in communication, public speaking delivery, pop culture, and mass communication. So with that, Adam, I am going to let you get started.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's so exciting to see all the things people have gotten into. Clearly, the marketing team at Yellowstone is doing their job because a lot of you said Yellowstone. But I want to before I begin this morning, I want to bring us back to a little bit of a story about something that's going to start and end the conversation today. And that is a conversation we've probably all gotten into in the last 2.5+ years, and that's with vaccines. It started with my partner who was having a conversation with my grandfather-in-law. Now, my grandfather-in-law is 90 years old, grew up a Methodist minister in New Jersey, moved to Alabama about 25 years ago. And you can imagine the steady media diet that this man probably consumes on a daily basis. And every day, my partner would go and text his grandfather a study, an information, giving him all this kind of information. And finally, I asked him, I said, well, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm just letting him know all these different things. And he needs to do this now, otherwise he's a terrible person. And I was like, okay, how is that going? He's like, yeah, he stopped responding. He doesn't respond to any of my messages anymore. He's not engaging with me. And it's just making me so upset because doesn't he realize what he's doing? And if only he had more information. And what a conversation between me and my spouse got into is a lesson that I think is applicable for everyone who's on this webinar today. And that's this distinction between information and communication. In a lot of cases, we think that if we just give people more information, they will obviously make the right decision because the information is so glaringly obvious. And it's this idea of having a tension between the dialogue we want to have, but it ultimately turns into a debate. That's going to be what we're going to talk about today. Now, my name is Dr. Adam Brooks, and as Kimberly said, I'm the Director of Public Speaking at the University of Alabama. And to give you some context of my background, most of my research has been in how do we help people with really strong technical backgrounds, engineers and STEM professionals, translate their ideas to non-technical audiences? How do we get people to connect and to communicate with one another? The other area of research that I spent a lot of time focusing on is how do we communicate about things like race and gender that are uncomfortable? And I'm going to use that expertise to bring you some knowledge today about how you can have more effective conversations about the hard things. And I don't really need to tell you all the reasons why you should probably pay attention, because if you didn't want to pay attention, you probably wouldn't have signed up to watch a guy from Alabama talk to you on a Zoom here today. And I know I'm from Tuscaloosa and y'all have strong feelings about that. So hopefully you'll forgive me for the next 45 minutes as we talk through this together. But I think when we think about why we need to discuss this now, polarization has never been more prevalent. A recent study done and purported by the Bureau of Economic Research in 2020 said that 1 in 8 individuals has been putting off having a difficult conversation over the last 8 months because of how they think it would go. And that was prior to the pandemic. Now we know that we're more polarized and we're also more fragmented. Our technological adaptations, whether it's pivoting to things like Zoom or living our entire social lives on apps, programs, and social media, has made us only more enabled to live our lives based on the rules of what happens on an algorithm. We are able to self-select into smaller and smaller fragments. And thus, it makes it harder to cross-communicate over different boundaries. It's also never become more important as we deal with the consequences of things like a global pandemic, a public health crisis, and of course, climate change. How do we have these discussions with people that ultimately don't agree with us? How do we make those better sustained information? That's what we're going to cover today. So our goal is going to be to shift from that destructive communication, things that leave you drained and harmed and ultimately not edging towards the progress that you want, into something more constructive. And to do that, we'll talk about three different things. First, I'll spend a little bit of time discussing what is communication and what does effective communication look like. Then we'll get into what are the barriers that make it more difficult and how we can learn to shift from hearing to listening. Then finally, we'll apply some of those techniques that we learned in the first two areas in order to apply it to a specific topic, in this case, how we talk about things like climate change. What are the ways in which those conversations break down, and how can we shift some of our conversational strategies so that they can proceed going forward? Now, throughout this, I would love if you have questions or things that pop up. I would love for you to put this in the chat, and we'll be monitoring this as we go along. Throughout this conversation, I'll also be asking you some questions. So while I pull up my slides, I want you to think about a question that I'm going to ask you for. When was the last time that you had a difficult conversation? What was the subject about? So put the subject and kind of how it went. So what was the last time you had a really difficult conversation? Maybe it was with someone who was vaccine hesitant. You were trying to get them to get boosted, or you were trying to get them to change the ways in which they were needlessly exposing themselves to COVID. Maybe it was about a situation where conversation had broken down between you and another coworker. What was a difficult conversation that you've had? Yeah, Stacy says about critical race theory in schools yesterday. You can imagine those things are fraught, made even more so by the fact that those conversations are done in a political atmosphere that has larger consequences than just the interpersonal relationships of what you're talking through. What else? Political perspectives, Erica. Moving my mother to my home due to her Alzheimer's diagnosis. Palliative care. Today on birth control and abortion. Let's hear a couple more. Yeah, money investment decision with a spouse or a husband. That is difficult. We've gone through that myself. We recently sat down with a financial person, and that is eye-opening. Climate change last week. Okay, that'll be Nadia. You'll be a great example as we come up in here in a little bit. Microaggressions in the classrooms and how to call them out as a student. That can be really, really challenging, especially when you're dealing with, okay, how much do I want to call this forth and what do I want from that outcome? So let's get into a little bit about communication, what it is, and how we can be more effective at it. And I think for a lot of folks, we forget a fundamental element that people tend to not leave jobs, they pretend to leave other people. What we learned from this is that in a lot of cases, it's not so much the workplaces that we find ourselves in where we tend to struggle. It tends to be about the relationships within those workplaces, the structures and the interpersonal dynamics that ultimately determine whether or not a team is going to be successful or not. But we also know that for many issues in life, a lot of people make it really easy to be like the image that we see here. And I have a quotation here from Thomas Carlyle about the greatest of faults is to be conscious of none. We need to be more conscious of who we are and our strengths and our weaknesses to be able to understand them. Now, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is some uncomfortable truths, but in order to solve for an issue, we have to adequately name and address the problems. So some of what I'm going to talk about today might feel 100% applicable to you, and some of it you may, well, I don't know that I agree with that facet of it, but just try to understand it before we begin to apply it together. So we asked you, and if you have any more that you want to put in, uncomfortable conversations. I shared with you the uncomfortable conversation we had to have with my grandfather-in-law about, okay, how and when are we going to do this and make it more successful? And I'll share with you at the end some strategies that we use that enabled him to feel more confident about his decision to get vaccinated. But first, let's dive into what do we think communication is? So why do we communicate? What is the point of communication? Well, for a long time, we believed that communication was really, really simple. When I moved to Alabama from Illinois, where I'd spent some time working in corporate PR, they always told me that whatever you do, if you can relate it to football, people will understand. So allow me to explain communication to you in the context of football, because I live in Tuscaloosa now, and that's how it goes. So we used to think that communication was simple. We used to think that it was basically, okay, there was a sender and a receiver. And it's a lot like football. You've got the sender, who's our quarterback, who's throwing it down the line to a receiver who's going to catch it. Now, in the chat, tell me why that's simplistic. What is that leaving out? Is it that simple as having a sender and a receiver? Is it that simple to having a sender and a receiver? So in the chat, call out what's missing from this model here. So in football, does the quarterback just automatically connect to a receiver? Contact in the defensive line. There's a defense. Yeah, the receiver doesn't always receive it. Absolutely. Just like in football, there are 11 other positions that are preventing the quarterback from reaching the destination of the reception. The environment. I don't know if any of you watched the Kansas City Chiefs play the Buffalo Bills last weekend, but that environment of Arrowhead Stadium created more barriers. Similarly, culturally, when we try to communicate interpersonally and in mass formats, there are barriers that keep us from being able to understand and relate to one another. People then evolved this idea. So in the 1970s, people said, okay, it can't just be as simple as sender to receiver. So instead, they developed what was known as the SMCR model. And if you've ever taken a communication class, some of this is going to be a wonderful refresher for you. But if you've never considered some of this stuff, it can be interesting to think about the things that we just know how to communicate. It's kind of like talking about talking. What you can see here is that the old belief was that there was a source, a message, a channel, and a receiver. That I, as a person right now, am putting a message together. I've created a message to give to you based on what I have encoded as valuable to you, what I think your common experience is, and you are hearing and seeing it, and then interpreting it through your own knowledge-based system as well. But of course, this also misses out a crucial step. If you look at the direction of this, this is entirely one directional. You don't know you're beautiful. Sorry, I love to make a little One Direction joke because I'm a millennial and pop music is the only way that I stay connected to the world. But you can see here, the directions go in one way. That's not how good communication works. And a lot of times, the more difficult the conversation is, we tend to revert back to the most simplistic and one-directional form of communication. I send things to you. Why don't you understand? So let's complicate this a little bit. What's missing from here is things like feedback and noise. How do we relate to one another? What are the ways in which we encode one another? Ultimately, when you are putting together a message, one of the most important elements that you can have is asking yourself, who am I talking to? And how do they relate to me? Audiences in general, and any person you're having a conversation, are pretty much inherently selfish jerks. We tend to only care about the things that directly impact us. Now, on the flip side of this, as we think about how we can be better with our communication styles, one of the most toxic traits that we think about is this idea of, I need to just be me. This is just the way that I am. This is the way that I communicate. This is just who I am. Stephen, in the chat section, excellent point about bias in the source and the receiver, leaving that out. What we know about communication is that it exists in the brain in the same space as your emotional intelligence. And according to the Harvard Business Review, in just a series of studies back in 2015, they looked at where emotional intelligence exists in the brain. And the ways to grow emotional intelligence and communication abilities basically comes down to one of three things: motivation, practice, and feedback. Well, you're already kind of motivated because you're sitting here on a Thursday afternoon listening to me talk to you about effective constructive communication. But how we practice that and the feedback that we get becomes more important developing our skill sets. So let's continue with thinking a little bit more about the goals of communication. The word communication comes from the Latin word communicare, which means to share or put in common. To share or put in common. When we think about it, in the chat, I want you to think about what you think the goals of communication are. What is the goal of communicating? When you're speaking to someone, what is the goal? When you're speaking to someone, what is the goal of communication? So in the chat, I want you to put what you think. I know that my screen has stopped sharing. I'm going to do that intermittently because it kind of helps balance things out. Understanding, achieve outcomes, the exchange of ideas and decision-making, absolutely. To bond, connection. You guys are so much smarter than a lot of the students I teach, because the students I teach, they always say, oh, information. But what we find out is that our goal is to make information meaningful. We are not just communicating to get information. We have access to information more than at any other time now than at any other point in human history. In fact, we suffer from too much information. There's a concept known as information overload, or what scientists are now calling cognitive backlog. It's kind of like that information by fire hose. You're all of a sudden getting way too much information. You can't process it. You can't make sense of it. And what you end up doing is suffering and you shut down. If you've ever received a really long email, you know what this phenomenon feels like. I don't know about you, but when I receive a really long email, my first tactic is I will turn to someone that I trust and I will ask them, hey, what are we supposed to get from that thing? Thus, we need people to help make information meaningful. And to this end, I want to share with you some goals of communication where you can be more effective with one another. The first is that we have to create shared meaning. Ultimately, it's the element of you understand where I am coming from and I understand where you are coming from. And we have a common set of experiences. There's a great communication theorist named Kenneth Burke who said that we can persuade someone to the degree to which we speak their language. And when he said this, he wasn't really talking about speaking English or any other language for that matter. It's that when we are communicating with someone, we are ultimately trying to assess, do you understand me? Do you get me? Do you share my experience? Can I identify with you? In order to achieve that, we have to operate from a space of value and respect. Now, verbal communication is something entirely different. When we think about this, I want you to think about it from a sense of both like public speaking, but more specifically, I want you to think about it in terms of interpersonal relationships. And with that, we think about task ordering. Verbal communication is most effective and constructive when we think about what is it I am trying to accomplish. Before you begin any difficult conversation, you have to ask yourself, when I'm done, what do I want the person to be left with? What am I trying to achieve? Likewise, the more technical the information, the more we have to consider the process of delivering that information. How are we going to say that thing? How are we going to say that thing? When I work a lot with folks in the STEM and scientific fields, a lot of the times what ends up happening is you have incredibly depth periods of information that never really takes its idea down the hall. Information becomes siloed. And suddenly you can have a PhD in chemical engineering that never talks to the PhD in mechanical engineering. And thus the product or the process or solution that they're developing becomes cross-pollinated. I'm sure you've all experienced this in your areas of public health or in the areas of public policy making. Finally, effective verbal communication is not so much logical as it is narrative. Now, I don't think we need to look further than the last 5 or 10 years to look at the fact that evidence is not the only way in which we make decisions. In fact, the only way in which we truly feel connected to a decision that we're making or an issue at hand is if we can see ourselves in the story. The trouble is that the stories we are telling are often misnomers and repetitive, and people shut down. So why is this so hard? Why? Okay, if we know what good communication is and we know how to be effective, we know we want to share this, what makes it so difficult? What are those barriers that prevent us from being effective and understanding where we're going and where we're coming from? What are some challenges that you have? In the chat, I want to hear from some challenges that you have when you are communicating with people about difficult subjects. Why is it so hard? What are the challenges you're facing? Felicia, emotions, that sense of all of a sudden it gets weighted because you get heated or they get heated and neither of you knows how to deal with that elements. The knowledge gap, distractions, stubbornness, resistance, wanting to be right, being interrupted. You feel like I come across as Charlie Brown's teacher? Andrew, absolutely. Feeling attacked and feeling defensive. You worry about lying. Yeah. Or are they lying to you? Are they misrepresenting the information? Being talked over and ignored? Absolutely. Let's get into some of these barriers and how we might begin to break them down. So for a long time, yeah, Candace saying the right thing. For a long time, we used to think that there was sort of a bifurcated or things were in a really simple binary between logic and emotion. That, oh, and you heard this a lot. Well, I'm just being logical. I just want to be purely rational. But I don't know about you, but do you know anyone who's ever smoked a cigarette? Do you know people who still smoke cigarettes? That is a purely irrational behavior. We have available to us loads of information that tell us about the dangers and carcinogenic effects of things like smoking and its impacts on your heart, lungs, liver, etc. But people still do them. Why? Because they make irrational emotional decisions. In fact, one of the most interesting findings that's coming out over the last couple of years in areas known as rational psychology and moral reasoning studies, look at the fact that we used to believe that people sought information and then developed an emotional response to that information. What we know now is it's almost the exact opposite. When we encounter things, we develop an emotional response. Then we seek information to validate the response that we have. If I hear something that is outrageous and I feel offended, I'm going to seek out information that validates the outrage that I feel. We also can see from this that words and phrases are simultaneously conveying both emotions and reasoning and logic. So we can't ignore one for the sake of the other. If we try to just have a rational conversation, or let's not get emotional about this, we almost forget that we're human beings and we cannot separate our emotions from our reasoning and evidence. In fact, they're inherently linked. So for this, I'm curious in the chat, what is the difference between hearing and listening? The difference between hearing and listening. So in your minds, what is the difference between hearing and listening? Ooh, Tiffany. Okay, I love hearing little clips like this that people write out because I find them fascinating. Don't make a permanent decision based on a temporary, hold on. Let me go back to it because I thought that was awesome. Hearing is receiving the ball and listening is knowing where to go with it. Ooh, Mary Morgan, good. That is effective. Andy, exactly. Hearing to interpret. Hearing is I hear you, listening is seeking to understand. Listening requires attention. Absolutely. Y'all are so smart. Y'all are so smart. The difference between hearing and listening, hearing is a physiological process. It is quite literally sound in your eardrums. Some of you, maybe you opened this and for some reason you're like, all right, this guy's got way too much energy, so I'm going to hear it, but I'm not going to listen. And you're opening up your email as we speak. Others of you, though, are engaging in a process of listening. Listening requires a psychological process that is a mix of attention, receiving, understanding, and then responding. Now, if you've ever been in an argument with a significant other or someone you're in an intimate relationship with, you've probably heard the phrase, you're hearing me, but you're not listening. I feel like you're not listening to what I am saying. You're hearing, but you're not listening. And let's sort of divest some of those distinctions. When you're listening, you are bringing your full awareness, but there are things that break down the pattern of how we do that. There are things that break down the pattern of how we do that. So some barriers to effective listening. They start first and foremost with ambushing. That sense of the conversation, we haven't made space for it. And suddenly it comes about uninterrupted. For example, in certain elements of my extended family, I get very anxious around them because I have to watch and make sure that some element of my discussions don't trigger it to become a political discussion, because in that particular subsection of our family, we cannot have an effective political discussion without people getting very heated and breaking down the relationships. Another barrier is that sometimes we're listening just for facts and not for full understanding. What this looks like is someone's going to talk about something and they say, well, did you hear that blah, 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 blah. And what they're listening for is I'm waiting for you to bring up this study that I already know how to defeat that study in the argument. And now I've gotcha. And all of a sudden our communication is breaking down. This one is my favorite. I teach a lot of undergraduate students, and faking attention. What that looks like is, yep. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, you're somewhere else. You're thinking about lunch. You're thinking about how you're going to get home earlier and beat that traffic, or how you're going to avoid construction. It's really easy to fake attention in the digital era because you don't have to look at me. I have no idea if you're paying attention right now. And then we have that sense of thought speed. This is something that I struggle with because I manage a little bit of a thing called ADD, and I sometimes get internal monologues that are going really, really quickly when someone's trying to talk to me. And if I don't make that conscious decision to slow down that element. That thought speed is going to shift it around. But there are others. There are things like our lack of interest. If we don't care about the subject, it doesn't really matter to us. Then we have distracting delivery, when people use things like ums and yas and likes and you knows. I am guilty of this because nothing gets more frustrating to me than when someone is sort of taking forever to get to the point. And you're like, okay, can you just get the point out? Because I just want this to be over with. Or you're so physically uncomfortable about what's happening that you want to speed through it as fast as humanly possible. Then we have arrogance and disrespect. When someone is just not giving you the same attention that you are giving them, it can break down your ability to listen. And suddenly, this is not going to happen. So Tiffany, yes, a Ross Geller, absolutely. And the other big barrier here that I think, especially when it comes to difficult conversations, is this last one, our pre-programmed emotional response. Our pre-programmed emotional response. This happens a lot in difficult conversations because we tend to approach controversial subjects as though we are all pundits on a cable news show. And because we consume a steady diet of bad punditry and bad discourse, we suddenly are pre-programmed to have emotional responses when certain things get brought up. It triggers us, for lack of a better term. And I'll give you an example of that here in a little bit, of a time in which I tried to have a difficult conversation with a student, and they were responding to me based on a pre-programmed emotional response of what they thought I was going to say and where they were going. Ooh, Stacy, y'all are giving me really great insights here. Volume, when you yell, I can't listen. Volume never determines truth or value. I also believe that volume does not equal energy. Sometimes people think that in order to have a lot of energy in a conversation, you have to be loud, and you don't. Of course, not to be totally hypocritical, because I am a loud person. So then let's think about a way to think of this differently. A lot of times we suck at communicating about difficult subjects because we pool in one of two camps. In the top of the graph here, you see the first element of how people respond to difficult subjects. Either they go silent, they shut down, they withdraw, they avoid, or they mask their comfort level. Now, on the opposite end are the controlling, labeling, attacking violence. Now, violence in terms of more relational, not in terms of physical or emotional violence, as opposed to like actual violence. Though sometimes that can contribute to that. My spouse and I are very different. When I get upset, I've learned from my passive aggressive mother to go into the silence realm. And my partner is from New Jersey. And so when my husband gets really mad, we get a lot of labeling and elements. And so we've learned over time to not retreat to those camps and to try to understand where each other is coming from. Now, in order to move from silence or violence, you have to approach it through a sense of safety. And ultimately, what is known as a shared pool of meaning, a shared pool of meaning. So you can't really have a conversation unless we're very intentional about constructing a sense of safety and a shared pool of dialogue, understandings, and experiences to ground that conversation. The problem is that when we get into difficult subjects, we move out of the shared experience and we retreat into corners of information, discourses, studies, talking points, things that are available to us through our socially connected and mediated worlds. Now, the other big element here, there's a fascinating study that came out in 2012, and this has been really insightful. And at the end of the slide deck, there are some resources and studies here, but I want to share this with you because this study came out in 2012, and it basically explains why a lot of the public health messaging that we've been receiving, constructing, and working with around things like the pandemic haven't been effective. So there are some evolutionary barriers, meaning that we have evolved to be predisposed to not receive certain kinds of messages or actions that cause us to change. And I want to spend some time to break down each of these. First is we have a propensity for self-interest. Basically, Even though we want to say that we do sacrifice self for the good of the group, historically, we are very bad as a species of doing that. In fact, there was a study where they told people about a water shortage and water usage increased. They said, sacrifice yourself for the good of the community, and more people used more water because they thought other people were going to take advantage of that situation. Second, we tend to believe that status is a relative factor. We think, okay, being a good person is absolute. But in fact, our ability to be driven for status is relative to the people around us. If I think that the use of a gas stove is a symbol of status, I'm probably going to put a gas stove in my home. Despite the fact that this morning, even on NPR, a new study came out that the emissions from home gas stoves because of poor construction fittings equals enough emissions to equal about 100 million cars in a day. Now, the third element is fascinating, and that's subconsciously, we tend to copy what we see. We tend to mimic other people. If you've ever watched the movie Mean Girls, you know that when I saw Katie Heron wearing army pants and flip-flops, I wore army pants and flip-flops. But more specifically, in the terms of climate change, we know that the greatest predictor of energy adoption tends to be what your neighbors are going to do. And a fascinating insight is that when you hold up reminders of people and say, oh, look at all these people not doing blank, it actually sends a signal to our brain that, hey, look at all these people doing blank. It reminds us that, oh, a majority of people are doing something, and if you're predisposed to doing that thing, you're probably going to follow suit. The second two elements, I think, are more obvious and probably more available to us when we think about it. And that's that we're predisposed to our present selves over future actions, especially if we are in a precarious community, or we are in an underdeveloped or underserved population, or we are in a high degree of uncertainty. So in a high degree of uncertainty, you're going to prioritize your present over your future self. And finally, we disregard problems that we can't see or feel. So we know what the barriers are. Let's break down some conversations that happen around climate change. And for each of these, I'm going to share with you what the message is and what the responses are that we kind of tend to hear. And then I'll talk through what are some solutions for how we would address those issues. So I'll talk about what do we hear, what the response is, and then I'll talk about what we could do instead as a result. The first thing we have to think about is the active listening model. So as we think about that distinction between hearing and listening, if we can make listening more active, what that involves is we receive information, which causes us to think about what it means to us. Then we try to understand, which invites us to ask deeper questions. What perspective are they coming from? Then we make an evaluative judgment about the relationship between what we've received and what we understand before we make a response. Notice how late in that process of active listening response is. I love the image here at the bottom of this slide because it asks a simple question. Are you listening or are you waiting to speak? The trouble is that over issues that we care a lot about, it can be hard when people say crazy things to you, especially if you are knowledgeable on it. A low stakes example of this is I teach college students, and it'll be amazing to me when I'm around folks that aren't at a university. They will make a lot of commentary about what today's youth are. And I always go, that's not been my experience at all. And they're like, no, you don't even know. I read this, blah, 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 and things break down. As you engage in difficult discussions, think about receiving the information, trying to understand the point of view of the person that you're talking to, evaluating its relationship to you, and then give a response. That is a distinction between dialogue and debate. Now, in a lot of cases, when we're talking about controversial subjects, we move right into debate, whereas a dialogue is a different process altogether. Let's break down the distinction between dialogue and debate. So first, in a debate, we defend our positions. We think my job in this discussion with my friend about climate change is I'm supposed to have an answer for every argument, which means that you feel like you got to do your homework. If you've ever felt like you needed to do research before engaging in a conversation with somebody, type yes in the chat. If you've ever felt like you needed to have all this research prepared before engaging with somebody in a conversation, type yes. On the other hand, dialogue involves listening to everyone involved and not responding when they say something, to just try to hear and to take in what they're offering. In a debate, your goal is to prove a point, is to prove your point. In a dialogue, your goal is to create a sense of common ground to build from. Think back to that diagram I showed you about the shared pool of meaning. In a dialogue, you're able to open up new responses beyond the typical ideological positions. Now, in a debate, it is an intimidating atmosphere. It makes everybody nervous. But in a dialogue, you allow more opinions in gray areas. And probably the biggest distinction between debate and dialogue is that when you are debating someone, you feel like you are representing a side of an argument. Whereas in a dialogue, you get to just represent yourself. And you can speak individually about what's confusing to you. What are the areas where it's not so black and white in terms of the binary thinking of either pro and con. As you think about difficult conversations like climate change and other things, I want you to encourage you to engage in a more dialogical form of communication. Now, that means a couple of things. First, it means you need to make space for it. So say, I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. Let's set aside 30 minutes for coffee sometime and really get into it. It can't be something that in the middle of an argument, someone brings up the subject and now you're going back and forth and back and forth. Now let's look at the example of climate change. For a long time, people operated under the principle of what was known as the information deficit model. So for a long time, a lot of communicators thought, well, people just need to know more information and then they'll make better choices about our environment. And the truth of the matter is that couldn't be farther from the truth. As you all mentioned in the chat earlier, we don't suffer from information. We suffer from people who are helping us empower and enable us to make better choices. A research study sort of summated what the common groups in 2016, Wiley Journal of Climate Communication came out with this kind of meta-analysis of the different studies that have been done. And they put together this table that I think is really effective for our discussion today. And there's basically 5 responses when people talk about climate change: avoidance, doom, dissonance, denial, and identity. And like I said before, we'll talk about what triggers it, what people respond to it, and then how to fix it. So when we talk about avoidance, what triggers people to avoid it is when we emphasize climate change as an entirely science-based issue. When we show them an abundance of graphs and infographics with all of these charts and numbers and directions, it tends to overwhelm some folks. When we talk only as a future state about what could happen if we don't take action. And when we take an emphasis on gradual long-term change. What also tends to trigger this is apocalyptic imagery of polar bears and distant places. What tends to happen? Well, people then shut down. They limit what news they get. They emphasize, well, we know that change is natural, so how could this be different? There are more urgent matters to focus on. Well, it won't really happen here. And regardless, I mean, we've adapted to so many things. We can obviously cope. How do we fix this, though? Well, there are some things that we can do. When you're having discussions about this, the examples that you use need to feel near, human, and personal to you. Giving examples of something far away doesn't help people feel like it is exactly in their backyard and is relational to the things that they care about. Speak of places and people in a hyper-local environment. So here in Birmingham, for instance, what are some examples of people who've been impacted by the uncertain environmental conditions caused by conditional climate change? Not conditional, but caused by climate change. Can we think of examples of people who've had their livelihoods destroyed because of a devastating storm that's only happening more frequently? And if we don't take specific actions, this is another thing. People get overwhelmed with what decisions that they can make. So in your conversations, if you can point to tangible actions that the person you're talking to is able to control, it's a lot to be able to say, we need to completely demolish the big agricultural movement and no one should eat meat. Instead, people feel more comfortable hearing things like, okay, maybe I reduce my meat consumption by 50%, and I can build from there to 25% before I go down to zero. If you can focus on the health of the person you're talking to and the ways in which they can benefit from some of the provisions that are being presented as solutions to something like climate change. Most of all, whether it's climate change or something like race in America, using emotions and stories are helpful. Stories are effective when they involve the use of our senses. That's, what did it smell like? What did it sound like? What did it feel like? Drop us into a moment in time. If you rely only on very distant data, then the conversation itself will also feel very distant. Yeah, exactly. Farmers who have too much or too little rain. Ski resorts and downstream effects of employments and support on cities and workers and families in those towns. Absolutely. But that conversation works if people value ski resorts. If you build out your information based on that pool of shared meaning of the person you're talking to and the relationship that you have, it's going to be more effective. Let's look at another example of a response that people have. If I were to ask you what the story of climate change is in the last 5 years, you could probably tell that story. It's an image of a dying planet, and we're all going to be suffering unfixable consequences unless we take action today. We use apocalyptic imagery, and sometimes that leads to what researchers refer to as doom, this feeling of inevitability. There's nothing we can do. What triggers that is when we consistently speak about what we lose and what it costs. When we overemphasize catastrophes and apocalyptic imagery, and we make messages about we have to sacrifice in order to survive. Now, while those things are true, because of a lot of the barriers we have and the predispositions based on the medias and the information that we consume, these messages tend to have the opposite impact. Instead, we tend to engage in spin. So you give them loss and cost phrase, they start saying, well, it's not really like that or like this. Or if you start presenting catastrophes, they start responding with solutions of their fear of it. Oh, so you're going to take away all of our car engines? What about the cost of change? How are we going to be able to ruin our manufacturing? And this is a big one. It's unpatriotic to acknowledge anything negative rather than thinking through that. So if this is where we are, what can we do about it? Well, we can think about focusing on hyper-specific near-term benefits. A great strategy is to think about the actions that we can take in things like climate change as a form of insurance. Play into things that people are already familiar with. In American society, we're very comfortable with the idea of paying a little now to avoid a long-term, very expensive thing later, just like we do with our insurance payments. I pay a certain amount every month so that if I get really sick, I'm not paying a ridiculous amount of money. We can unpack the problems with the American healthcare system in another lecture. But that's a great way of sort of analogizing how we can make similar elements and forward payments on things that we need to do to ultimately change things like our energy structure. Ultimately, we need to think about framing these issues as positive emotions. What are the positive emotions that we get to feel as a result of these elements and taking these actions? Let's go through another example. A lot of times what happens is we feel dissonance. So what this looks like is making people feel guilty about things that they're doing. And suddenly they feel guilty, but human beings psychologically will do almost anything to avoid feeling guilt. As a result, what we tend to respond is but I mean, does anybody really know? I mean, can you really trust those studies? I mean, they'll say this week, but what are they going to say next week? You can also probably draw some correlations between a lot of the public health pandemic messaging and what I'm describing here. So how do you fix this? Well, you can say things like, I think it's just better that we're safe than sorry. We could illustrate solutions in positive, desirable ways. Ultimately, we have to think about making actions easier and more convenient for people and tell stories of things like green growth. How have people adopt green economic practices that ultimately led their businesses to succeed, that enable them to do more? those play into the existing value frames that people already have. If we ignore the value frames that people perceive information through, and unfortunately, because of this system that we've lived in, people tend to interpret things as, how is this beneficial for me? And I know that some of you are hearing that and you're going, well, it shouldn't be that way. And I agree with you, but we have to think about how we adapt what is to what we think it should be. Finally, there's denial. And that sense of, I want to lose my identity as an individual who cares about blank. Classic example of this is when we sort of analogize climate deniers with Holocaust denial and other kinds of really extreme forms of comparison. Well, that ends up leading to them to attack you and saying ad hominem attacks, or you politicize science, or you're the enemy and I'm tired of this kind of opposition, or boy, it's cold today and they talk about global warming. When we get into these kinds of things, it can break down communication. How we fix this is by utilizing peer messengers that the people will find trustworthy, ensure face-to-face interactions, and re-emphasize things like competition and the desire to be better. I'm going to skip this part now. I shared with you before some of those evolutionary barriers about how we fix to those things. There are elements that we can best address. We can think about things like, I want to be a good community member, and tap into the idea of being someone who's seen as a good person. When we go back to that model of those crucial conversations, a question that I want all of you to take away from today is, when you're in a difficult conversation and emotions start to get pressed and you find yourself shifting from a dialogue to a debate, ask yourself this question: what is it that I really want from this conversation? What is it that I really want? And is what I'm going to say next going to enable me to advance my goal or retreat from it? Am I advancing towards my goal, or am I retreating from it? What do I want from this conversation? If you think about that at the beginning of these hard conversations and while it's happening, you can redirect the ship when it goes off course. So let's think about this in terms of that model that I showed you before of like, okay, I got to think about what I'm doing and where I'm going. And then I might think about, how do I give that kind of constructive feedback when it's really difficult for other people to hear? And there's a complicated model that you can see here, but one of the tools that's really effective is the state my path method. The state my path method involves starting with facts, then shifting to the story you're building off that fact, then ask for others' opinions or others' experiences. In this, you want to talk tentatively and encourage testing. You are not the only person with the only answer and the only solution. What that means is that you begin to build effective narratives and you're speaking from your own experience. What are some things that led you to the position that you have on that issue? What are some things that are challenging for you as somebody who believes in X, Y, or Z? When we engage in that and we operate from language that builds a sense of, hey, I don't have it all figured out, it encourages that same sense of vulnerability from scholars like Brené Brown and other folks who epitomize those same elements. So how do we do this? Well, we got to get good at it. And the way that we get good at it is by practicing it on a regular basis. Think about it in something as simple as, how do we have a dialogue about a more difficult conversation that's not so political? And maybe it could be about your shared finances in your marriage. When you relay the values and respect to someone and you reiterate them, especially when things get tough, people are more likely to listen to where you're going. We can also use the evolutionary barriers. I mentioned before that people are motivated by self-interest and that their status is relative. We tend to copy other people. An example of how we could use that to our benefit. Think about when you're at a hotel and you get that little sign that tells you to reuse your towels. I'm sure most of you are all like, oh, I absolutely do that every time. But what a study found was that when people checked in and they told people that a majority of our guests reuse their towels in order to help the environment, would you be willing to do the same? And they verbally asked them to commit to that, people were more likely to do it. Another study did a similar thing where they had people put a green sticker on the door if they were going to reuse their towels. And as people were walking down, they see that everybody else is doing that, and it makes you more likely to do the same. When we reinforce and make visible positive pro-social behavior, more people are likely to adopt those behavioral messages. So make an appeal to those interests. I'll leave you today with a lesson of something that happened to me. When I taught a class this summer, it was the first time that UA had sort of rolled out its, you can You can not wear a mask indoors if you're vaccinated. Now, we know the failures of that, but it led to a student saying, well, I'm not vaccinated in the middle of class. And it was really interesting. And I said, okay. And the student said, well, aren't you going to respond to that? I said, no. He said, well, why not? I said, well, because there's nothing I can say that's going to ultimately make your decision. You have to make that decision. It's not my job to tell you what you should or should not do. He said, well, I mean, you're not going to argue with me about it? I said, no. I said, if you want more information, I'm happy to provide that to you. He said, but I'm more curious about like where your hesitancy is coming from. And then he just started talking and I started listening. And what it came down to was that he didn't really trust the media. And what he wanted to do was talk to a medical professional. I said, okay, do you have a doctor? He's like, no. I was like, so do you don't have access to a doctor you could talk to? He's like, no. I said, well, why don't I help you figure out a doctor you could talk to? And then you don't have to trust what I say. You can listen to somebody that you trust. That night I got an email with a picture of his vaccination card. And he's like, I just appreciated that you listened to me because I was ready for another person to debate me on it. And I was so tired of everyone telling me what I should do. It's an example of what happens when we engage listening practices and more dialogues more effectively. Now, I know I've given you a lot of information and I really appreciate your time, but I hope that you remember today that when things get difficult and when it gets really hard to deal with some of this stuff, I want you to ask yourself, what is it I want from this conversation? Am I listening? And what are some ways I could be more effective in avoiding some of the triggers that I went through? I want to thank you all for your time, and I'll leave it now to kind of open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for all of that. I know that all of us really learned a lot. We've got a couple of questions that have come through the chat box. I think we've got time for one or two of them. The first one is, often when we're advocating for policy changes, we don't have a lot of time to establish rapport or practice active listening. So do you have any tips or tricks for keeping that communication brief, but still being thankful or being effective?
Yeah, I think that's a distinction between when you are trying to engage in this kind of dialogue at a policy level. It's ultimately some of that is influenced by political incentives, both economic and social, that it's hard to burst through. But it's like, if you cannot have these conversations in public with the decision maker and you're having it in a one-on-one basis where at least they can understand where you're coming from and get them to open up to you about the vulnerabilities that keep them to disregard the information that you're giving from a public policy standpoint, you at least have a better understanding of one another and can figure out where that common ground is to build from. But that's really hard to do if you're only communicating with each other in super formal, structured, public conversations. You kind of have to bring that stuff backstage. At least that's what I believe, to kind of work.
Yeah. And then the second question is similar to one that you and I had talked about, which is, what role do you think that social media is playing in contributing to and solving the issues that we discussed today?
I think social media is contributing to that because most of us are getting and engaging in our information in what amounts to a kind of a warfare. If you think about algorithms, they privilege things that are outrageous. So they're going to find the most outrageous thing, and then that's going to get a lot of people upset. So it's going to get a lot of comments. It's going to get a lot of shares. The more comments and shares it is, the more likely it is to be seen by more and more people. So most people, when you're engaging it, also, I've been guilty of this. I get mad at someone and respond very quickly. I'm not listening to them. I'm not building shared values. My brother-in-law is very extreme on Facebook. And when we get in person and discuss things, we have a much better time discussing them. So I would say, like, making forward progress on this, don't do these things on social media. It doesn't really work. And it is too easy for people to engage in that kind of debate versus a dialogue, because then I'm representing my entire side. And all they'll do is spend their time searching for one piece of information that invalidates one thing that you said. And it's like, haha, I win. But ultimately, go back to that question. What is it I'm trying to accomplish? If my goal is to look smarter than my neighbor, well, congratulations. If your goal is to build a group of people that want the same things that you do, or to try to disrupt some of the mis and disinformation that people are consuming, it's probably better to happen offline. But that's hard because we're in the middle of a pandemic. So it's like, how else are you going to communicate with people? Doing things like, hey, I'm actually curious. I want to do a catch-up call. Can we Zoom one another for a little bit and have coffee together and kind of see how the conversation happens in a one-on-one area?
Yeah, absolutely. So the last question that we'll have time for is actually a really interesting real life example, which is how do you start difficult conversations that ultimately only benefit you? And her example is getting your roommate to do the dishes.
Okay, this is where you go back to that state my path method. So you start with facts, be like, hey, listen, I've just noticed that over the last couple of weeks, every day when I come home, the dishes are in the sink. And the story that I'm making up about that is that it's really that you're being really disrespectful to me and that you're being disrespectful to our home. I don't know if that's the case. Is there something else that's explaining like what this is for you or what make it hard for you? Because ultimately, like here's how I interpret that action. How do you interpret that action? And ultimately come down to like start with your understanding and then ask for their understanding and then let that be a conversation. If you go into it with I need you to do the dishes, they're going to have a negative response. But I know it can feel manipulative, but if you use that tool effectively and can kind of ratchet down the discussion and make it more of a dialogue, you'll probably get a better action. Because ultimately, what do I want from this conversation? I want you to start doing more of your fair share around here so that I don't have to come home to dirty dishes every day. Hopefully that was helpful.
Well, thank you so much. Do you have any last kind of parting words before we sign off?
I know that everything I said could seem very, very simplistic and maybe a little bit watered down, or maybe it seemed like as the one attendee asked, like, am I advocating for sort of avoidance of engaging in debate? I think that debate can be good if we are trying to make a specific decision and it's like at the end of this, we're going to make a decision, right? But like we're going to debate this back and forth. But if we're just talking endlessly and there's no structure around it and there's no research or shared common understanding of how those rules are going to happen, that can break down. But I would encourage you that like the first couple times you do this or engage in this, you're going to suck at it, and just understand that you're going to suck at it until you get better at it and better and better. So don't shut down if the first time you try some of these practices, it goes poorly. It's just about trying to recalibrate. Okay, I say know where it fell apart and what can I do differently next time?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if anybody wants to share this presentation, it will be available on our website. And so you can check back tomorrow or the day after, and we do have the full recording there. Dr. Brooks, thank you so much for your time. I think a lot of people got a lot out of this. So we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
Yeah, and if people want to connect with me, they can find me on LinkedIn or you can email me at adambrookspHD@gmail.com.
Thank you so much. Everyone have a great afternoon.